Hello and welcome to Enterprise Tech Spotlight. My name is Keith Hales with InfoSystems, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who may be new to the Enterprise Tech Spotlight podcast, this is actually a relaunch of something that we did a few years ago. We took a break for COVID, but we're back now. And I want to thank everybody for joining. And on the Enterprise Tech Spotlight, our primary goal is to help business leaders and I'll say technical business leaders as well get educated and get involved in the IT aspects of their business. So whether you are a senior IT person inside of an organization or you're a business person who wants to learn more about IT or maybe has oversight or responsibilities in IT, then this podcast is for you. So joining us today for our first of the relaunch series is Robert Goodwin, our CTO. So Robert, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Keith. Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to have you back. So today we're going to be talking about having standards inside of your business and why it's a good idea, or why we think it's a good idea to set IT standards for your organization, especially as your organization gets larger and becomes, moves from that really kind of small mom and pop shop to maybe a commercial sized business or all the way up and even into the enterprise space. So help me understand, basic high level, why would a company want technology standards?
If you're not careful, you end up with sprawl. Right, and what I mean by that is you end up with 8 different versions of something, and you got 16 different ways of doing whatever, and it just becomes an administrative nightmare. It just creates a lot of overhead and frustration. So, getting standards and having standards, and adhering to standards, because you got to check yourself, is you simplify your life from an IT perspective. And, things become easier to handle. Executives now know what to expect, especially from a financial standpoint. IT leaders know what to expect as they get acquired vendors and what they're going to be looking for. It just makes everybody's life a lot easier.
So I totally agree with that point there. So what are some examples of standards that a company may have implemented? So a company that an individual may be listening to us, how would they be able to know? What are some tea leaves they can kind of read to see whether or not their business has actually implemented any standards?
Well, let's take the operating system right off the bat. That's usually the number one thing, right? Or do you have 16 versions of Windows in your environment? Or are you still running things that are no longer supported by the manufacturer? Standardizing on relevant release, maybe one release back that's still supported. Your tech teams and your help desk and even end users you get a consistent. You get the same screen, the same interface, the same stuff, and everybody knows what to expect. So you reduce call count because your end user's not going, well, you moved my icon on you.
Help desk call count? Is that okay?
Help desk, thank you. Okay. Good clarification. Help desk call count. Your end user satisfaction goes up, and people just are happier, right?
What about, does vendor management get easier whenever you have standards?
Absolutely, because instead of having, again, maybe 5 different vendors that you're dealing with the same platform, I'll just endpoints for laptops and desktops.
Sure.
If you have, let's say you go with a Dell solution or an HP solution. If you have chosen one of those manufacturers, while they have a variety of items that you could choose from, different levels of systems, you're only dealing with one vendor or maybe 2 at the most. And again, from an ordering, from a shipping, delivery, the hardware, the engineers and the techs understand what the hardware is. It's consistent. They're used to the platform. Things just become easier. You have less issues that arise.
So what you just mentioned was a lot of, I'll call it, operational challenges that are really savings if you standardize. So that could be hard cost, right? If you're working with 1 or 2 vendors, you can maybe consolidate vendors and maybe get better pricing.
Yep.
If you're working with 1 or 2 vendors, then also your cost to support goes down because you're not constantly training your people on 5 different platforms. They maybe have to learn 1 or 2 of those platforms.
Absolutely. Your skill ramp is a lot flatter, right? So to that point.
Yeah. We hadn't thought about that, right? So as you hire internal IT people, let's say that you're hiring somebody who's green, right? Their time to value is a lot shorter because they're having to learn a lot less breadth of information.
And with the standards, usually accompanies documentation. So you instead of having to keep up documentation on 5 different hardware platforms, you may only have 1 or 2. So someone who's coming in green, existing documentation is going to be relevant. So they're going to be able to reference that quicker, get to it, and get to that quick time to value.
Okay. So next question is, should every company try to mirror all the other companies? Should every company have the same standards as they're trying to set these standards?
No, because every company is different, right? It's just like individuals. One company, let's take the financial sector, right? What they need as a standard may be completely different from a manufacturing standpoint, or even a hospital, right? Medical facilities. You have to kind of almost look at what your industry is, and you almost have to follow what that industry group and what their best practices are to create the standards you need. And on top of that, it really is determined by what your business needs are, because your business needs may be different from somebody else's. InfoSystems business need, as a business partner, is completely different than a retail person.
So you mentioned industry groups.
Yep.
So obviously, if you're in a specific industry, you can look and see what your peers are doing. So you can look at industry groups. Obviously, there may be compliance standards that have to be met along with that as well.
Absolutely.
Also, I think size matters too, right? The size of your organization is going to then determine maybe some of the flexibility you have in setting standards, and maybe some of the options that are on the table.
It does, because let's say you take a small shop, right, and you may only have 20, 50 endpoints. You're going to want a standard, but you're not as rigid in that, because as a small shop, you're still flexible. You can adapt pretty quickly. Depending on what regulations or compliance needs you may have, that will impact that, but you're still able to adapt fairly quickly. That's the beauty of being a small shop. As you get bigger, you're going to want to reduce that, because as you grow, your teams grow, and the more time is going to have to be spent, if you don't standardize, of them chasing a lot of the various details of these things. If you have a standard, start building your standard as you grow, and you adhere to that standard, your growth actually gets easier. And then as you get into like the enterprise area, you have to have a standard. Otherwise, you're just going to run yourself right in the ground.
Yeah, so the returns on investment of setting a standard increase as the business gets larger.
Correct.
Okay, so you just mentioned, as your company grows. So let's say there's a company out there that doesn't have any standards now, and they're expecting growth soon, or maybe they're just wanting to save cost on operational IT expenses of help desk phone calls, or just things breaking all the time, right? So how would they get started?
Refer to your policy manual. Do you have a policy manual? Some people may not, especially if you're a small company. But let's say you have some policies. What are those? Are you following these policies? Do they cover things like standards? And they most of the time probably don't.
Probably don't.
Right. So you have to, if you don't find anything there, you need to then you need to do an analysis, like a gap analysis. What do we have today? What are we looking for? What do we want? Part of that may be the discovery of what you want. And if you get that analysis done, then you can understand where you are and what it's going to take to get where you need to be. Right. So this is something we do for some of our customers as well, as the whole gap analysis on what are your hardware needs, what are your application needs, and we'll come in and do a nice report. And
does a company's future growth plans have any impact on the type of standards they want to set?
Absolutely.
So give me an example of that.
Well, so if you're going to double in size, right? Let's use a small company and you projected growth, right? So if you have 50 people today and you're going to grow to 100. The incremental effort to go from 50 to 100 to double in size is drastically larger than what most people realize. Well, we just doubled. It's easy to do. No, it's not. It's vastly hard to do, because, again, as your team grows, as your support staff grows, if you don't have standards in place, you're going to just create chaos.
So what is a good methodology for a company to establish standards? Do they only talk to their peers? Do they talk to an outside consulting company only? How do they form these?
So you can do that, right? You can reference your peer groups. You can reference outside consultancy companies. But really, ultimately, what you're trying to do is create a standards committee.
What's that?
So a standards committee is a group of people who create and set the standards that the company is going to follow. People that would be in this group would be an executive, usually a technology executive. You will usually have operational executive or leader in that group. You'll have some of your people that are either mid-level managers for the bigger enterprises or for the small groups. You're going to have somebody who's kind of got their finger on the pulse, right? The not necessarily a field tech. I'm struggling with the term here, Keith.
Like a frontline worker?
Yeah, thank you. Frontline worker, somebody who's got real life experience, because as people move up in their careers, you're not as close to it, so you miss things. Having a dispersed group of people and cross-departmental as well. You may want somebody from finance in there. Right.
I would think you do want somebody from finance in there.
Because they have a voice in that one for sure. So as you create this cross-departmental group and they create those policies and set those standards, and they sit there and gnash teeth and argue amongst each other, and they come out of it with here's what we're going to do, and we have decided X, they implement that, right? And then once it's implemented, you have to come back and audit it and check it.
Well, that was going to be my following question. So how often would a set of internal company technology standards, how often would that need to be revisited?
My suggestion is at least twice a year.
Okay. Why is that?
Technology changes very quickly, right? Or you may have an outside event that causes you to need to go back and revisit. You may be changing ERP platforms. You may may have had a cyber event. You may have had, who knows what, a disaster of some type.
You may have acquired another company.
You may have acquired another company. And in that case, you definitely want to see what do they have, what do you have, and how are they going to align.
Okay. So how would a company address non-compliance to a standard? So I'll just, we see this all the time, right? So there's somebody at the top, and maybe it's the IT senior leader or the CFO or somebody who has set a standard for the organization around, let's just say, some kind of technology platform. And then there's maybe a manager who goes rogue and thinks that they are not, their technology needs are different. What is the right way for a senior leader who's kind of pulled in to try to maybe moderate some of these discussions and mitigate some of the challenges? How should they approach that topic?
Well, first thing I would ask the rogue person, what was the need? What business justification was there for this? There may have a valid reason, right, that the committee may have missed or not understood. So that would be the first step. And then I would, if there is some valued reason that they need to have this, that needs to be incorporated back into a standards committee meeting. If there's not, right, it's just somebody says, well, I want this because I like this. Well, that's where you have to gingerly nudge them away and say, well, this is the standard, this is what we have to do. Because if we don't do this, and you explain to them the value of having the standards and what happens if we don't, and chaos ensues.
So as far as the, I'll call it the holding people to a standard, it sounds like it's really about the business conversation first.
Correct.
Yeah, because we see this all the time where there will be different departments have different sets of priorities specifically relating to IT, right? So there may be, the finance is always looking for ways to lower cost, which makes sense, right? Saving the company money is a good thing. The IT folks are always wanting the latest and greatest because they're wanting to deliver a good, high quality service back to their people. Typically, the frontline workers just want it to work. They don't want to go through a whole bunch of changes. I just learned the new system.
Make my life easy.
So what we've seen is finding a balance is often the hardest thing to do. And you mentioned earlier having a cross section of different folks, a diverse group who can speak into this, often mitigate some of the pendulum swings in IT, and they help everybody have a voice at the tables, because ultimately technology is designed to help support the business. It's not the ends to itself. It's a means to an end.
Correct.
Right? And so forming a standards committee with the right leadership is going to help a company better leverage technology as opposed to it being some type of stumbling block, or often it becomes a distraction.
But it does, because if you don't have the standards, or you have somebody that's kind of going rogue, well, if he did, why can't I? Right? And then it just quickly runs right off the tracks.
Yeah, no, we definitely see that as well. All right, well, I think with that, we're going to wrap up our conversation on standards for Enterprise Tech Spotlight. So thank you, Robert, for joining us.
Appreciate it, Keith.
We have Robert joining us for another one here called, another podcast where we're going to be talking about modern infrastructure and how the infrastructure world has changed with not only cloud computing, but also with hyper-converged and hybrid environments and what all that means. And so we hope that y'all can join us for this next one, and thanks a lot.